Hey, howdy ho. This is a re-recording of the Dev Shop lecture I gave on July 3rd. The audio from the actual lecture was absolutely botched. I hadn't changed anything about my setup, and yet everything was echoey and pitchy and basically unusable. Hopefully, going forward, I won't have to do this again. So, running Dungeons and Destiny. Right off the bat, I want you to know that everything you do for D&D applies to D&Destiny. How you plan your campaigns, how you make monsters, how you run encounters, all that applies to D&Destiny just the same as it applies to D&D, and you don't actually have to change anything about how you run games to get a lot of mileage out of D&Destiny. And yes, that applies to all the various nuances from GM to GM. D&Destiny is robust. It was designed to survive being homebrewed and tinkered with to your heart's content. So what's the point of this lesson? Well, as much as D&Destiny can survive and do just fine, being treated like it's regular D&D, you and your players will get a lot more out of it if you are aware of and support the fundamental design differences between the two engines. Couple things though before we go any further. Number one, I am going to assume you already know how to play D&D. You know what attack rolls are, you know what saving throws are, you know how classes and leveling up works, you know what an adventuring day is, and so on. If you don't know these things, this lesson might be a bit over your head. I am also going to assume that you have at least read the Player's Guidebook and know how D&Destiny works. You know what light and darkness zones are, you know what ability recharge rules are, and you know Guardians don't have hit dice and they don't heal the same way as Adventurers do, etc. This is not a bare-bones walkthrough of how to run D&Destiny from the ground up, covering all of the mechanics. That said, if there is enough interest for such a lesson, I could put one together. There are three fundamental areas of difference between Dungeons & Destiny and D&D. They are resource management, ghosts, and encounter design. We're going to start by going over resource management. So at its core, D&D is a game of attrition. The player characters, or PCs, are meant to experience 6 to 8 encounters in an adventuring day. Whether or not you, as a GM, end up cramming that many encounters into an adventuring day is a different topic, but the game is still designed for that to occur. Most of these are combat encounters, but they don't have to be. Any situation that risks the resources of the PCs is an encounter. And the point of doing this is that the more encounters the PCs go through, the harder future encounters become, because PCs are meant to lose resources little by little throughout the day. They might start at full hit points and then lose 5 hit points across each encounter until they come to that final deadly encounter at the end of the day, your boss fight or whatever it is, and suddenly things are very intense because they don't have as many tools or options for confronting that deadly boss. D&Destiny flips this on its head because PCs get their resources back very easily. D&Destiny has what's called a brief rest, which is 5 minutes of downtime, wherein the characters do nothing more strenuous than hard walking or jogging. At the end of a brief rest, Guardians get back their melee, grenade, and superclass ability charge, as well as all of their shield points. And this is a common misconception. No, a Guardian does not regain their health points at the end of a brief rest. They can use a medical toolkit or their ghost to regain their health points. They only get their shield points back. So basically, because Guardians get so much back so easily, the game becomes less about attrition management over several encounters and more about each individual encounter itself. This was done so that D&Destiny would fall more in line with the video game experience as well as with how people tend to realistically run D&D. Wizards of the Coast may have built 5e to be 6 to 8 encounters a day, but the majority of players only do 2 to 3 encounters a day, at least in my experience. I'm not omniscient, so what do I know? But as a GM, when you're building content for your players in Dungeons & Destiny, even if you plan on cramming 6 to 8 encounters into the adventuring day, each and every one should be built assuming the party is going to be at full health and full resource. And yes, some resources are more restrictive, like how the Sunbreaker's Inner Flame is on a short rest and how super abilities only automatically recharge on a short rest too, but those are the exceptions, not the rule. The rule is that your Guardians will be busting into every fight at full strength. The next big difference comes in the ghosts. Ghosts are actually one of the gameplay aspects that I wish I had better discussed and conveyed in the text, that I had given a little bit more time to explaining their purpose in the design of Dungeons & Destiny, because no, you don't actually need to make ghost characters to play Dungeons & Destiny. You can handwave them and ignore their stats, and the game will run just fine. We've actually done significant testing in exactly that state. Ghost stats are there for those who want them. There are many people, myself included, who don't view rules as restrictive in terms of narrative. Instead, we view rules as ways to keep narrative consistent. So having consistent rules for how ghost memory works and consistent rules for ghost HP and ability scores and skills, all that stuff, that adds to our sense of narrative. It's easier to remove content than it is to build content, and our job at Velvet Fang is to make sure people have the tools, knowledge, and, content they need to start playing the campaign of their dreams right away, and thus we built ghost rules. But seriously, you could ignore them. If you don't need consistent ghost rules to make the campaign of your dreams, ignore the ghost chapter and don't even glance at the ghost classes in the Architect's Guide. Those classes are there for players who literally want to play as a ghost, not as a guardian. And one super important note is that ghosts do function exactly like normal D&D adventurers. They have hit dice, they make death saves when they are reduced to 0, they recover all lost hit points after a long rest. The only difference is that there isn't really a healing spell you can get for a ghost, so damage to them becomes a little bit more worrisome, though there are some guardian abilities that can heal ghosts, like the Sunsinger's Wall of Radiance, and there's basically healing potions, or the equivalent of healing potions in the Architect's Guide as the restorative light. The last major difference is going to come down to encounter design. So D&D is built on the premise of one monster being a good fight for a party of 4 adventurers, assuming the monster's level, also called its challenge rating, is the same as the party's level. So if you have a CR4 monster or a level 4 monster, it is a good fight versus 4 player characters that are all 4th level. If you had a CR16 monster, that would be a good fight against 4 level 16 player characters. D&Destiny does not subscribe to this at all. D&Destiny wholly embraces the video game concept of the heroes being pitted against waves of enemies that far outnumber them, and everything about how monsters are designed plays into that. A lot of class abilities and weapon perks rely on getting kills, too. So throw minions and summoned creatures at your fire team so they can get those kills and activate those perks. And you can see in our Ultra Creature design, they have some sort of mechanic built into them that basically forces smaller, easier to kill creatures onto the field, explicitly so Guardians can get those kills and keep their buffs rolling. Furthermore, as a GM, don't be afraid to kill your player characters. In fact, one of the first things you should do, especially if you have a group of new D&Destiny players, is get their player characters killed. Get them killed and walk them through how resurrection works and get them used to dying. Guardians often go up against creatures that can one-shot them even at higher levels, but part of the game is that you are going to die and your team is going to resurrect you and you're going to keep going. That said, always have a plan for what will happen next if the party wipes. I don't care if the party is gearing up to do a raid or if they're doing a lazy Sunday patrol in the EDZ. Always have an idea of how to keep the story moving even if everyone dies. Here's some really basic examples here, let's say everyone dies, you as a GM can say the ghosts survive and escape, and now the party has a chance to regroup and reassess the situation, because so long as their ghosts aren't dead, then, they can just fly to a light zone and resurrect the party. And this is a classic plot trope that you see in action films all the time. It's really not that big of a deal to whip this out and use it on your party. The ghosts could also survive, but become damaged, and pass that damage on to their guardian. Maybe they lose an ability charge, or they always roll at disadvantage when trying to make a specific ability check. This could last for a given period of time, or it could be permanent. When you do this, the party will be able to move forward just like the first example, but even if they win the next confrontation, they will still have to carry the consequences of their failure from the first time. There's still going to be a lasting effect from what happened. You could also do something like the creature that killed the party becomes a legend or hero among their faction, allowing them to rise in power and become a personal antagonist for the party. And finally, the villain not delivering the final blow and instead walking away just before utterly annihilating the protagonist is another really common trope. And you can totally use it if your party is at a state where your last guardian standing, situation happening here, they're down to 1 hit point, and the villain, you make your attack roll, the villain hits, but instead of describing them killing the Guardian. You describe them gloating and knocking the Guardian out and leaving them to die, but of course the party gets to regroup and try again. Honestly, whether it's D&D or D&Destiny, death or mission failure is actually one of the most powerful and fantastic storytelling tools at your disposal. I mean, if you think about it, the classic hero's journey requires failure in order to have the catharsis of victory later. So don't shy away from failure, especially while you're new to D&Destiny and trying to get accustomed to how everything works. It's much faster and there's a lot more damage going on. And just work with your party to figure out a way forward. And that was basically it. It was a pretty short lesson, though afterwards we did have an extended Q&A time. There were a lot of really good questions that were brought up, and I'm going to go over just a few of them right now. One of the first questions was that, in lore, Guardians are painted as tireless, so does the exhaustion system from 5e still apply to PCs in Dungeons & Destiny? And the answer to that is yes. And we actually have some monsters that specifically play into exhaustion, because even though Guardians are, zombie demigods and they can come back from the dead and all that, while they are alive, they are essentially just normal people with magic powers. They still get tired, they can still die to disease and starvation, as we know from the Drifters lore. And even if that weren't the case, fundamentally, because we're shifting mediums in games here, Destiny 2 is a video game, whereas Dungeons & Destiny is a tabletop role-playing game. Because we're shifting mediums, we do have to make certain changes and adjust a few things in lore. Not because we're trying to say, oh, this is better. It's because we're trying to just make use of the medium we have. And exhaustion is one of those things inherent to our medium. We're using the D&D 5e engine. And we also like the idea of exhaustion, and we like the narrative opportunities that affords GMs when exhaustion is allowed rather than hand-waved away. So we kept that in there, and it does still apply to your Guardians. If you do die of starvation, though, just res it off, you'll be fine. Another really good question was, how's the best way to interact with ghost-only PCs in battle? And the way to do that is going to be thinking a little outside the box when it comes to how you're going to design your encounters. You can't really just do, all right, here's some bad guys, kill them to move on. Start thinking of ideas like, okay, the Guardian characters need to get through the door. The Ghost character is going to do a skill challenge to try to get through that door. And so you're going to do initiative like normal, and when it gets to the Ghost turn, they're going to make one ability check to try to contribute to the skill challenge. If they succeed, congrats, they get a success. If they fail, more enemies get added to the room at the end of the round. And so a situation like that is actually going to be opening not only gameplay effects for all people involved, you're also going to have these narrative moments, like if you had a ghost who was really bad at hacking doors and kept adding more and more enemies because they kept setting off more and more alarms. That is a narrative opportunity in the middle of combat to keep everyone engaged and talking to each other. And then the last question that I'm going to go over here that we got during the Q&A. The Q&A lasted for like 45 minutes. There was a lot going on in there. But last question I'm going to go over here is that, are there any Destiny themes that I would suggest new and prospective architects or GMs should avoid running at the start? And right off the bat, I'm going to say things like raids, Ahamkaras, Oryx, things like that, your god characters, your characters or villains who are supposed to be incredibly powerful and cunning. I would recommend, if you are a new architect or a new GM, not to run those kinds of characters. Much in the same way that if you were a brand new artist, I would recommend you don't try replicating the Mona Lisa right away. There's a lot of skill and nuance and just plain old knowledge you're going to need to accumulate before you're going to be able to run those characters at the level you're probably imagining in your head. And it's not to say that you're, a bad GM or anything like that. You're new, like the example was given. A new artist cannot start off by just painting the Mona Lisa. You have to learn how to draw humans first. You have to learn about construction lines. You have to learn about color and composition. And you, as a new GM, you need to learn your system before you start going into super complex and super advanced enemies or villains for your party to go against. Also, I'm just a random cat on the internet. You do you. It's your game and it's your art. I'm pretty sure there is someone out there who did literally start trying to paint the Mona Lisa. And you know what? Good for them. This is just my recommendation, but it's your life. You do what you want to do. And that is going to wrap things up for this recap of the July 3rd lesson. Hopefully in the future it won't be a recap and I'll just, be able to record the lessons and put them up here. I hope you enjoyed this, and if you really like what we're doing and you want to see Dungeons and Destiny continue, please consider supporting us on Patreon. Really want to keep making this game. Have a good day, make good choices, and try not to die, and come around to the server next Sunday and join us for our next lesson. Links are in the description.